I'm so sorry not to be with you. It would have been a real pleasure and an honor to be in St. Petersburg, but unfortunately we all know the reasons why many of us were not able to come and join you. Thank you for this great organization, which has just shown, how helpful you are. And the paper I'm going to present is part of a larger project, of a book project. And I apologize for the cursory nature of the paper, which is just going to highlight a few elements. So Francis Haskell's famous 1971 article, The Manufacture of the Past in 19th Century Painting, opens onto Paul de la Roche, Cromwell et Charles Ier, and with questions regarding the strange fate of this kind of history painting that went from being very influential to completely disregarded. So further in the same essay, Haskell mentions that John Singleton Copley, somebody we've just heard about, also painted a picture dealing with the life of Charles I, but some 50 years before de la Roche, and he alludes to this particular painting, Charles I demanding the 5 impeached members of the House of Commons. So this painting took 13 years to complete, and it was actually started when Benjamin West, another painter we just heard about at the end of your presentation, Maria, Benjamin West exhibited this painting, his Oliver Cromwell dissolving the Long Parliament. And this painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1783, and that's when Copley started his Charles I. About this painting by Benjamin West, there are very few details on how exactly it was commissioned. We know that it was commissioned by the Earl of Grosvenor, and it was commissioned along 3 other 17th century subjects in the wake of the Earls purchasing the sensational death of General Wolfe. So there are not many details. We don't know exactly where West took his inspiration or elements like that. So that's one of the reasons why I would like to throw light upon an iconography that has suffered an even worse fate than historical painting, and that is historical prints, because both Charles I demanding the 5 members and Cromwell dissolving Parliament had indeed been widely circulated in the form of engraved historical illustrations before being painted by West and Copley. And I'm showing you the 2 engravings here that correspond to the 2 paintings. So these 2 illustrations were published by a very renowned and famous publisher of the late 18th century, John Cook, and they were published in history books that were rehashed versions of Rapin de Toiras' History of England, and they were aimed at the growing readership of history in Georgian Britain. If we look at the subscribers list for those history book, we can gather that their subscribers came from a very large cross-section of the educated middle classes. They were quite widely disseminated as well geographically, as well as socially, attracting support from readers as far as Nova Scotia, Jamaica, from members of the gentry, the middle classes, from clergymen, lawyers, army or navy officers, surgeons, doctors, merchants, craftsmen, and also from women. Despite being seemingly written by different authors between the 1760s and the 1790s, those pictorial histories published by John Cook were in fact did not vary much in content, but most importantly, they all contain the same set of illustrations designed by one single artist, and here he is. That's the only known portrait we have of him, Samuel Whale, who was a fellow foundation member of the Royal Academy, fellow foundation member to West, of course, and he was also the first professor of perspective of the London institution. And together with a team of engravers, Whale invented a new template for historical illustration, not a headpiece, not a tailpiece, not a frontispiece, but a narrative scene presented on a single page, framed and captioned. With Whale, and without him for several years after his death, the team of visual artists employed by Cook produced well over 100 such historical scenes, keeping to the very same formula. The plates were reused in dozens of publications, but also repurposed on canvases and recycled well into the 19th century. So in line with the topic of the conference today, I wish to retrace how those images were manufactured and produced. And I'm going to draw, obviously, on Francis Haskell's works, but also on Stephen Band's pioneering works. And my aim is to address the role of historical illustrations in the development of ideas about national history. To this end, I'm going to briefly chart the production, circulation, and reception of those historical illustrations, focusing on a very, very small number of examples, of course, in order to analyze how they played a part in the advent of the historical as a new aesthetic category. So these historical illustrations were innovative visual devices when they were formulated in the middle of the 18th century. And the context for their design is, of course, the vast escalation in the production and circulation of engraved illustrations in books or periodicals from the mid-17th century. These printed book ornaments are also to be situated against the backdrop of the illustrative frenzy caused by the translation from 1725 of Rapin de Toiras' Histoire d'Angleterre, which prompted a new craze for portraits from the past, that's how Francis Haskell called them, or heads, as they were called at the time. That is to say, engraved galleries of portraits of past rulers. But Rapin history was not only a gallery of portrait, it was an anecdote-filled narrative punctuated by sentimental and dramatic stories that were to be understood in teleological terms so as to justify the recent evolution of the British political regime. And of course, that's an approach that became commonly known as the Whig interpretation of history. Rapin's colorful account prompted readers to visualize memorable episodes, and many provided the basic plots for plays, for instance. But it was also the main inspiration behind a very ambitious visual project called the English History Delineated, a list of 50 events that made Britain, from the landing of Julius Caesar to that of William Orange, presented to the public in 1749, but this project failed to attract enough subscribers and did not materialize into a lavish visual publication. However, the very idea to outline the historical trajectory of the nation since ancient times in pictures, to delineate its identity through a visual sequence, was precisely taken up by Samuel Whale. He trained as an engraver, but he left engraving to become a designer for booksellers and publishers, and he practiced book illustration as an art in its own right. Over his career, he produced more than 400 wash drawings that were transferred onto copper plates by engravers and used by booksellers to entice customers to buy their publications. And many Georgian bestsellers were actually illustrated by Samuel Whale. Early on in his career, he specialized in historical illustrations. So his first historical illustrations looked like that. They were made for a textbook intended for children, a historical textbook for children that was written in the form of question and answers. And there were 28 of them, very small, very basic, as you can see, but already presented on full pages and captioned. And of course, these basic plates were placed in front of the pages, in front of the textual depiction of the visualized event, and they functioned as substitutes to the text. That's what Stephen Bann explained in The Clothing of Cleo. Each plate being a metaphorical, by metaphorical substitution, an action related in the narrative. So this pedagogical set was constantly reprinted until the early decades of the 19th century. But while this was being reprinted, Whale was commissioned a new set, more sophisticated, as you can see, for Thomas Mortimer, History of England, New History of England, and it was published between 1764 and 1766. It was much more ambitious, and it was dedicated to Queen Charlotte. And the artist made 33 brand new designs for this series. And over the following 20 years, Whale kept adding new plates to the initial 33, and augmented sets were issued for other history books. And all in all, more than 100 different historical scenes spanning more than 1,800 years of history were designed by Samuel Whale. They were the first comprehensive visual sequence dedicated to British history, a remarkably unified, albeit discrete, corpus. Each scene was presented framed on a page and embellished with highly decorative borders inspired by the latest trend. And you can see the Rococo borders, but they became more and more classical over time. Borders changed with every edition. So they were composed of a frame narrative scene, and they became a lasting template for history book illustrations. As you can see, there are multiple framing effects. The page, of course, in itself, the inner rectangle in which the design is positioned, and then the decorative borders around it. And these framing effects, of course, acted as powerful deictic devices, singling out events clearly identified by captions and brought to the attention of viewers as self-contained scenes. While separate instruction to binders were issued to help those who wanted to place each plate in chronological order in front of the corresponding page where the action was told, those narrative scenes were printed on unpaginated pages within borders that underlined their portability and allowed for their being filed in separate albums, for instance, used to grandiorize other books, or even pinned on walls. As such, they offered an overview of British history, a kind of panoramic vision of the past before the panorama was even invented or popularized. Frames also hinted at illustrations being pictures rather than pages, and this was reinforced by the many borrowings from actual paintings used to visualize the deeds of past Britons. And we have instances of elements being copied from medieval materials, for instance, from John Fox's Acts and Monuments, of course, and also from paintings that were repurposed on book pages. For instance, this particular illustration, Charles I taking leave of his children, shows an affectionate father bringing his younger son close to him and giving his last advice to his 3 children. And the composition, of course, is clearly borrowed from this particular painting or from the reproductive engraving that was made from it. And this, the painting and the engraving are from a series that was commissioned by the Bowles brothers and that was published in 1728. Whale adapted the horizontal composition to the vertical size of the book page, bringing the 4 characters closer to one another. He kept many elements from the original painting, but he also turned Princess Elizabeth towards the viewers, displaying her grief, emphasized by her use of a handkerchief to wipe her tears. And this is a very tiny example to show how the artist staged the events, animated characters, portrayed their emotions in an attempt to trigger a process of identification that elicited an emotional response. Not only did the illustrations stage and animate historical characters, but they were also represented as reconstruction of the past. And from this perspective, historical illustrations pertain to what Francis Haskell described as a reconstructive genre. Contrary to classicizing history paintings, Whale's plate did not portray historical characters wearing the same timeless classical draped gowns. In this Stuart scene, you can see that he modeled the decoration on the painting and on other paintings that were used as primary sources, considered as primary sources. But for earlier events from which he couldn't borrow from painting, he recreated the material environment, recreated costumes, recreated architectural elements. And each and every individual plate has got a different setting and different costume. Romans wear sandals, short tunics, Saxons wear longer tunics, and then, towards the 14th century, medieval garments become tighter fitting. Tudor and Stuart dresses, of course, are described in much greater details. And then Whale, who was a renowned architectural draftsman as well, also differentiated the features from Norman, Saxon, Tudor, Stuart, Palladian buildings. Examined today from a historian perspective, both the outfits and buildings look like fancy approximations of past dresses and monuments. But they were informed by antiquarianism, of course, and by antiquarians' distinctive engagement with material sources. However, they did not present beautiful ruins of medieval abbeys or dramatic remains of slighted castles, but reconstructions aimed at resuscitating the original appearance of buildings. And this creative process, of course, was consistent with the rule of decoro that had been followed by painters since the Renaissance, and which drew artists' attention to the necessary concordance between the specific figures and objects represented and their context. But it went beyond the rule because this rule had allowed the generalization of classical dress in history painting. So what Whale did is that he used things as visual time markers. And the chronological sequence that he designed materialized through a succession of sartorial moments and architectural styles. Periodicity came in support of the didactic aim of the plates, supposed to help viewers master chronology, but it went much further than that, providing viewers with believable scenes with representations of the past that could be deemed authentic. The constant reworking of the set and its numerous reissues seem to confirm sustained interest among diverse viewers. Although individual elements of reception of the plates are difficult to access, we can trace their influence on the artistic community. For instance, Benjamin West's Oliver Cromwell Dissolving the Long Parliament presents many compositional similarities with the plate Oliver Cromwell Dissolves the Parliament, designed by Weil in the mid 1760s. Both are structured around the speaker's chair, placed in the center against a wall where open curtains on both sides let the sunlight flood in through large lattice windows. To the right of the chair, a table situated in front of it. Then there is Oliver Cromwell standing in front of the table, a hat on his head and a sword hanging behind his left leg. He's portrayed in a very similar commanding attitude, looking to the right, his right arm outstretched, hand lifted to prevent resistance from the speaker on the book plate, finger pointed towards the mace, ordering a soldier to remove it on the canvas. On the engraving, as on the painting, the central piece of furniture is a wooden canopied chair with Corinthian pillars, while the English statesmen wear a similar short doublet with white collar and cuffs in both pictures. Both compositions focus on the removal of the mace. The soldier has already got his hand on it in the painting, and the conspicuous support of the army embodied by the heavily armed soldiers in the foreground is hinting at the futility of any protest. On the engraving, the mace's unstable position is left to express visually the dissolution of Parliament, as its members can already be seen exiting to the left. The speaker is standing aghast, and the clerk, equally dismayed, is hurrying as if pushed out by Cromwell's hand. A similar play on movements can be observed on the painting, where the momentum of Cromwell's gesture seems to throw the speaker off balance, while he's in fact being pulled from his chair by Colonel Harrison. West uses the landscape format and imposing size of the canvas to increase field depth and give an all-round view of the action, peopling the shallow space with a tumult of figures, displaying a greater variety of expression as would be expected on such an ambitious painting. The structure is obviously more sophisticated and enhanced by its use of colors and texture, as well as by the effect of light and shades, which emphasizes the glaring brightness of Cromwell's figure. So I would not want to blow things out of proportion and draw too much on the slideshow to a descaling effect, which allows me to highlight the parallels between those two very different images. But since the wonderful topic of the conference has been an invitation to investigate the production of the past, I would like to underline that the reconstructive methods initiated by Weil were long-lasting. For instance, many painters, like Benjamin West, who were involved in the development of historical painting at the end of the 18th century, did borrow their subject from this particular set of historical plates. This is the case with the group of painters who were commissioned to contribute to Robert Boyer's historic gallery. To follow up on the topic of the Cromwellian regime, I would like to mention Thomas Stovald, whose Cromwell Dissolving the Long Parliament, which is now only known through a reproductive engraving, was painted for Boyer around 1806, and which again focuses on the central elements that you can see on those two examples. So that's a third derivative image. Several decades ago, the alleged part played by Benjamin West in the revolution, the so-called revolution of history painting, was qualified when David Solkin stressed the radical novelty of Edward Penny representation of the death of General Wolfe, who painted the death of the general in modern dress and exhibited this painting some 8 years before West's. Similarly, I would like to reintroduce a friend and colleague of Edward Penny, and in fact on the group portrait of the foundation member of the Royal Academy, Samuel Wales is sitting next to Edward Penny. So I would like to reintroduce Samuel Wales in the narrative of the transformation of history painting into a historical genre in Britain, pointing at the crucial part played by his imagery in the construction of popular ideas and even to the growing sense of the past. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Susan Siegfried. Fascinating talk, Isabel, thank you. Do you think there is significance to Copley and West as outsiders to the British art establishment at these early stages in their careers, taking up subject of British history on such an ambitious scale at a time when national history was still contested in status as a genre for history painting?
Yes, definitely there is, of course, Susan. Thank you for your question. At the same time, another cycle of historical painting by West was made for the king, of course, because as you know very well, he was a historical painter to the king, to George III, and he made a whole cycle of painting around the figure of the Black Prince for Windsor Palace. So yes, in a way, I think Copley and West were in a position in which they had both more freedom to address British history and also interest as coming from a part of Britain that had been contested, and you know, obviously the event of the American War of Independence is really informs many choices that they made as well. So yes, thank you.